The pressure hull groaned, a tortured sound like grinding tectonic plates, the noise vibrating deep into Dallin Russick's sternum. 3 seconds. That was the margin before hull breach alarms screamed across the forward section of the mining platform. Stygian dawn. The air recycler was failing again, coughing out thin, metallic-tasting vapor, thick with the stale smell of ozone and the cold dampness that signaled failing environmental seals. Dallin's knuckles were white against the console grip, his jaw locked so tight he could taste the grit of old, worn alloy on his teeth. He was deep within the superstructure, a section designated for salvage only, far from the primary command cluster. He fought the inertial dampeners, compensating for the rotational drift induced by the initial impact, an impact no sensor sweep had predicted. The official report, dictated by the sector governor back on Centauri Prime, called it an unforeseen micrometeoroid swarm. Dallin knew the official report was a lie designed to suppress panic and avoid liability. Micrometeoroids did not generate the specific, sharp resonance spike his outdated seismic monitors had registered seconds before the dawn shuddered itself apart. He shoved his weight against a jammed pressure valve near the auxiliary power conduit. The metal was slick with condensation and the greasy residue of decades of neglect. He had been stationed on this derelict rock, officially supervising the extraction of rare isotopes, unofficially exiled after the unfortunate RE-6 incident 3 cycles prior. The governor, Brina Dagan, had made it clear: perform menial labor until the shame of incompetence faded. Shame was a luxury he could no longer afford. With a final desperate heave, the valve screamed open, not releasing pressure, but redirecting auxiliary flow. The lights flickered, then stabilized from a sickly amber to a weak, functional white. The immediate structural collapse was averted, but the victory was purely tactical. Logistically, the platform was failing. The life support matrix was operating at 40% capacity, and the comms array was slag, a consequence of the swarm shearing through the primary antenna cluster during the first minute of chaos. Dallin dragged himself back to the engineering bay's observation slit. His breath hitched, not from exertion, but from the sight beyond the reinforced plastiglass. Eclipse Haven. The black expanse surrounding the asteroid belt was punctuated by pinpricks of distant starlight, but directly opposite the fractured hull. Something was wrong with the background radiation signature. It wasn't a ship. It wasn't debris. It was a void in the noise. The background telemetry, the constant, irritating static of interstellar interference, was absent within a specific perfect hemisphere centered just beyond the wreckage of the main reactor housing. It was the visual equivalent of a sudden, absolute absence of sound. His internal chronometer registered the time elapsed since the initial strike. 47 minutes. 47 minutes of blind, frantic repair under impossible conditions. He keyed the emergency short-range beacon, knowing the signal would barely reach the skeleton crew on the habitat spire, miles away, but protocol demanded it. Control. This is Russick, Engineering Beta. We have stabilized the reactor conduit rupture, but primary comms are lost. Requesting immediate atmospheric integrity scans on sectors Gamma and Delta. Recommend immediate crew recall to Central Spire. Repeat, structural integrity severely compromised. The response was not the expected clipped confirmation from control, but a wash of pure, sharp static, far cleaner and more organized than random interference. It sounded purposeful. Dallin leaned closer, pressing his ear against the cold metal frame of the slit, fighting the urge to rub the exhaustion from his eyes. The static resolved itself, not into language, but into a rhythm, a series of low-frequency pulses, almost infrasonic, that resonated unpleasantly in his inner ear, causing a momentary wave of nausea. This was the sensory data that had been filtered out, deliberately suppressed, in the reports he had received after the Ara's Sixung failure. He had argued then that the energy signature preceding the disaster was artificial, complex, not natural decay. Governor Dagan had called his analysis paranoid, attributing the readings to faulty equipment on his part, a result of stress. The pulsing stopped. A single high-pitched tone followed, impossibly clear, and then a projection bloomed against the darkness outside. It wasn't a holographic display, nor a directed energy beam. It appeared to be light itself, shaped and held in place by some incomprehensible field distortion. The image was geometric, a swirling, impossibly intricate pattern of interconnected lines that folded in upon themselves in ways that defied known spatial geometry. It was beautiful, cold, and utterly alien. Dallin felt the familiar, heavy cloak of cold dread settle upon him. This was not the work of pirates, nor the aggressive maneuvering of a rival corporation. This felt like observation, like analysis conducted from an immeasurable distance by something that viewed the integrity of the Stygian dawn as less significant than the properties of a crystal structure. He fumbled for the platform's emergency manual override for the environmental sensors, bypassing the crippled main computer. He needed hard data on that localized absence of radiation. He didn't care about the fractal. He cared about what was generating the field that could erase interstellar noise in a hemisphere of space. As the sensor array whined to life, struggling to collect data from the outside, the projection outside shifted. The fractal vanished, replaced by something worse. It was a simplified schematic of the Stygian dawn, instantly recognizable, yet rendered with deliberate distortion. Key structural points were glowing a virulent, toxic green, indicating catastrophic failure points. But superimposed over the schematic, positioned exactly where Dallin was currently located, was a small, perfectly drawn symbol. It was not Veskar, nor any known galactic trademark. It was a circle bisected by a sharp vertical line. His breath hitched again, this time a sharp, painful intake of the recycled, stale air, that symbol. He had drawn it himself, years ago, in the margins of his final academy thesis, a philosophical representation of the necessary internal quarantine. It was a symbol known only to a handful of disgraced theorists and himself. Someone, or something, had not only found him on this forgotten mining outpost, but was displaying an intimate knowledge of his personal intellectual failures. The silence from the unknown source intensified, heavy and expectant. The pressure in the hull, momentarily stabilized, began to creep downward once more. Dallin realized with a chilling certainty that the meteoroids had not destroyed the platform. Something had allowed the platform to be critically damaged and was now waiting to see how the last insignificant human engineer would choose to die. And they knew precisely who he was and what ghost he carried. The cold seeped through Dallin's environmental suit, an insidious dampness that had nothing to do with the temperature gauge. He stared at the projected symbol, the quarantine mark. Feeling the artificial stillness of the observation slit press against his cheek, he had to move. Remaining tethered to the failing auxiliary conduit was a choice between a slow asphyxiation or an immediate explosive decompression. Both outcomes were functionally identical to the command structure waiting for his demise. He slammed his fist against the manual override to the sensor buffer, forcing the diagnostic stream into his helmet display. Bypassing the corrupted internal processes, the data scrolled too fast. Jagged lines of energy flux peaking and collapsing, but one reading held steady. An anomalous signature centered exactly where the alien field terminated. A concentrated packet of highly ordered complex subatomic vibration. It was structured data, intentionally shielded. Too dense for the primitive sensors to fully resolve, but undeniably artificial. It was a footprint, a digital calling card left by something that did not fear the void. Dallin forced himself away from the glass, the movement stiff, fueled by adrenaline that had long ago burned past its useful reserves. He grabbed the emergency maintenance tether, a coiled synth steel cable, and clipped it to his harness. The air in engineering beta was thin now. The recycler's wheezing had dropped to an irregular gasp, and the metallic taste was overlaid with the acrid scent of burning insulation. He needed to reach the primary junction box in Sector 4, the only remaining pathway to manually route emergency oxygen flow to the habitat spire before the remaining crew members succumbed to the thinning atmosphere. He activated the magnetically locked boots and stepped out of the observation bay, moving into the cramped maintenance crawlspace. The platform was tilted at a severe angle. His world was now a vertical plane of hanging cables and free-floating debris. The weak white light from the temporary power source cast long, distorted shadows that danced with every slight settling of the fractured superstructure. He was not thinking about escape. Escape implied a future. Dallin was operating on the immediate necessity of mitigation, a habit drilled into him during the RE-16 fiasco, where hesitation had cost 37 lives. He remembered the faces of the recovery team, their expressions grim, holding files stamped with Governor Dagan's seal, classifying his frantic warnings as stress-induced hallucinations. He remembered the way Dagan's perfectly manicured hand had smoothed over the final dismissal document, the gesture of casual dismissal more brutal than any physical blow. That memory was the ballast keeping him anchored now, preventing the psychological drift that could incapacitate a man trapped in a tomb. Navigating the twist in the secondary coolant line required him to contort his frame, the synth steel biting into his ribs. Halfway through the narrow passage, he felt the vibration return. Not the soft rhythmic pulsing from before, but a deep, grinding thrum that felt less like an external sensor sweep and more like the platform itself was being microscopically rearranged. The sound resonated through the metal skin beneath his boots, a low, resonant frequency that threatened to shake his very bones apart. The structural supports, already stressed past their tolerance limits, began to complain in earnest. A high-pitched screech tore through the air as a primary load-bearing strut snapped somewhere above him, followed by the heavy, wet sound of pressurized coolant venting into the vacuum. Dallin threw himself flat, wedging himself into a recessed conduit, housing just as a cascade of fractured plating and shredded insulation rained down where he had been standing a moment before. The air quality in his helmet plummeted. The scrubber could not compensate for the sudden influx of toxic gases mixing with the near vacuum. His internal chronometer flashed a stark, urgent warning. 30 minutes of viable atmosphere remaining in his suit environment. The low thrumming ceased abruptly, replaced by the dead quiet that followed violent destruction. Dallin remained pressed against the cold housing, waiting for the next phase of the alien observation. Then the short-range comms unit crackled violently, overridden by an external signal. It was not the complex, structured static from before. This was a filtered, modulated burst, directed specifically at his suit frequency. It was human speech, but heavily corrupted, sounding as if it had been transmitted across 1,000 light-years of collapsing space-time. Sick, Russick. Sector 5, confirmation. Dallin activated the transmission relay, fighting the impulse to yell into the microphone. This is Russick, Engineering Beta. Identify yourself. What is your location? The voice returned, clearer this time, though burdened by static that suggested immense signal degradation or perhaps intentional interference. It carried the clipped, authoritative cadence of the Galactic Defense Authority, the only military body with jurisdiction over corporate sector failures. This is designated Agent 2. We are outside the interference envelope. The Stygian Dawn is classified as a failed asset. Your emergency beacon was received, but the data packet was flagged as compromised by Governor Dagan's administrative override. Dallin felt a surge of white-hot, familiar rage. Brina Dagan. Even in the face of what was clearly non-human aggression, the governor's bureaucracy moved faster than salvation. "Override invalid," Dallin spat, forcing his voice to remain level despite the tremor in his hands. "My structural readings confirm external systemic interaction. This is not equipment failure. I need immediate deployment of emergency recovery assets, specifically heavy atmospheric containment teams to the habitat spire." The agent's voice flattened, losing the faint echo of urgency. "Negative, Rusick. Recovery deployment is suspended pending Sector Command assessment. Governor Deegan has filed an official declaration citing total platform instability due to unauthorized energy output. The platform is deemed a biohazard containment risk. Your beacon was routed through standard administrative channels, which prioritize stability protocols over individual life support after 04 hours of compromised integrity." Dallin stared at the shattered remnants of the coolant pipe, the toxic mist swirling around his boots. 04 hours. He had only stabilized the reactor 20 minutes ago. Dagan had moved faster than the disaster itself. She wasn't trying to save the crew. She was ensuring that the last potential witness to the true cause of the RE6 South incident, and now this, was neutralized before any external authority could interrogate the wreckage. "Agent 2, Dallin said, his tone dangerously quiet. "What is the standing order regarding an engineer who possesses classified data that contradicts official findings regarding 2 separate catastrophic failures on this platform?" There was a pause on the line, a silence that felt heavier than the alien void outside. When Agent 2 finally responded, the authority in the voice was replaced by a weariness that transcended mere exhaustion. "The standing order, Rusick, is containment. However, the external energy signature you reported, the one that collapsed the noise field, has triggered an immediate, non-standard mobilization alert. Our mandate supersedes local gubernatorial control when existential threat vectors are confirmed." Agent 2's voice dropped further, becoming almost a whisper against the harsh static. "We are approaching fast, Rusick, but the signature is still active. It is not retreating. It is studying the pattern of damage. You must get clear of that structure immediately. We cannot authorize engagement within the debris field. The collateral damage projection exceeds acceptable parameters for this contested border region." Dallin looked down at the symbol etched onto the hull schematic, the circle bisected by the line. A quarantine marker. He understood now. The aliens were not attacking an outpost. They were containing a potential vector of contamination, and Deegan had just confirmed their assessment by locking down the site. He was not a survivor awaiting rescue. He was contaminated evidence to be sealed. He looked back toward the primary junction box, Sector 4. The only way to reroute the oxygen to the habitat spire miles away. He could flee the platform and wait for the GDA to secure the area, condemning the rest of the skeleton crew to suffocation under Dagan's administrative lockdown. Or he could attempt the impossible, risking annihilation by the external force or by his own side's overzealous containment protocols to save those who still believed in the lie. Dallin gripped the heavy wrench at his belt, the metal cold and unforgiving in his gloved hand. He had 30 minutes of air left, and he was standing between the cold logic of an interstellar observer and the desperate survival of his species' remnants. The habitat spire was his objective, regardless of the governor's decree. He turned his body away from the safe route toward the exterior docking clamps and toward the failing, toxic heart of the failing structure. He began crawling toward Sector 4, moving directly into the path of the unknown entity that had just confirmed his deepest, most paranoid fears. The air in the crawlspace was turning viscous. heavy with the smell of hot electronics mixing with Dallin's own rising internal temperature. He ignored the internal chronometer flashing 25 minutes remaining and concentrated solely on the magnetic lock of his boots. The grinding thrum had returned, louder this time, accompanied by a high-frequency whine that felt like microscopic needles vibrating behind his eyes. The external observer, the entity responsible for the clean void, was getting closer, or perhaps it was simply increasing the intensity of its scrutiny. He reached the access hatch for Sector 4, a heavy durasteel plate bolted shut against routine radiation leakage. He knew the internal manual release mechanism was almost certainly fused from the initial impact, but he had to try. Dallin jammed the heavy wrench into the seam beside the locking wheel, leveraging his entire body weight against the thick metal. The strain sent jolts of searing pain up his arm, a dull ache that was rapidly developing into a grinding, undeniable injury. He ignored the pain, focusing instead on the sensation of the metal groaning under duress. With a sharp tearing sound, the metal around the bolts sheared. The hatch swung inward, not smoothly, but sagging heavily on its bottom hinge, dragging against the twisted flooring. The sudden rush of hot, stagnant air that greeted him was worse than the near vacuum. It smelled of overheated processors, lubricants baked dry by internal heat spikes, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of burnt protein. Sector 4 was now a furnace. Dallin plunged into the chamber, the magnetic boots locking him precariously onto the ceiling which, due to the platform's severe angle, was now the only viable floor. Cables hung like dead vines, many frayed and sparking weakly, others melted into slag. He located the primary junction box, a large armored container that housed the manual routing interface for life support. It required a direct, hardwired bypass to push the oxygen reserves toward the habitat spire, a maneuver usually requiring 4 technicians and several hours. He activated his helmet's tactical illumination, slicing through the gloom as he worked the access panel, which buckled ominously under his touch. The whine outside intensified, oscillating in pitch until it felt less like sound and more like a physical pressure wave attempting to separate the molecules of his suit. His HUD flickered wildly, displaying phantom readings, ghost images of structural failures that weren't present, overlaid by warnings that the external entity was actively interfering with his suit's internal diagnostic software. He found the manual override terminals and ripped the protective shielding off. The wiring cluster was a nightmare of melted insulation and exposed conduits. He needed to cross-reference the tertiary flow regulators with the emergency atmospheric exchange valve, a complex, 3-part sequence. He pulled up the schematic on his visor, attempting to overlay the digital map onto the physical chaos. That was when the second, more personal failure occurred. As he reached for the primary conduit bundle, his injured arm gave way. The sharp metallic shriek from the wrenching had done irreversible damage to the ligaments or perhaps strained a failing bone. His grip vanished. The heavy wrench, no longer magnetically tethered by his failing suit systems, slipped from his paralyzed fingers. It did not fall down toward the floor of Sector 4. Because of the platform's impossible tilt, the wrench drifted slowly upward, out of his reach, settling against a cluster of high-voltage plasma conduits near the ceiling seam. The object was now positioned perfectly to bridge a connection between the conduits, an action that would result in a catastrophic power surge capable of detonating the residual isotope stores in the adjoining module. Dallin watched, his breath catching painfully in his throat, as his most crucial tool became an instantaneous self-destructing trigger. He had seconds. He could attempt to grab the wrench, which meant risking immediate electrocution or causing a localized explosion that would instantly sever the life support routing he was trying to establish. Or he could ignore the falling tool, focus solely on the bypass, and save the rest of the crew, knowing that if the surge occurred he would die and the platform would vaporize, taking the habitat spire with it. due to the proximity of the remaining structural stress points. The logic of survival screamed for him to stabilize the bypass. The logic of penance demanded he retrieve the wrench. He was trapped in the cruel calculus of the battlefield, where inaction was an action, and every choice carried a death sentence. Dallin's eyes locked onto the 3-wire sequence required for the atmospheric routing: red to tertiary, blue to auxiliary, yellow to primary seal. He forced his good hand to steady itself, the fine motor controls screaming in protest as he worked the insulation stripper. The metallic tang in his suit intensified. The heat was oppressive now, baking the moisture from his skin. He jammed the red wire into the tertiary node. Contact. A small, satisfying click echoed in his helmet, a sound of technical success. He reached for the blue wire, his vision beginning to tunnel from the rising internal suit temperature and the dwindling atmosphere. Then, the external presence made its move. The high-pitched whine outside snapped into a deafening, broad-spectrum electronic scream. The lights in Sector 4, the temporary safety lights powered by the auxiliary conduit, did not flicker. They simply died, overwhelmed by an electromagnetic pulse delivered with surgical precision. The world plunged into absolute blackness, save for the pale, sickly green glow emanating from the 3 points on the junction box where Dallin had made contact, the 3 points of successful routing. The entity was not trying to destroy the platform randomly. It was isolating the functions it deemed relevant. It had allowed the life support repair, only to nullify the power feeding it. Dallin felt a jolt of pure, cold clarity. The external entity wasn't a mindless destroyer. It was an analyst that understood system flow. It knew what he was trying to do, and it was systematically disabling the pathway to the habitat spire, confirming his status as a vector to be contained. His suit atmosphere gauge plummeted. The failure of the secondary lighting system had triggered a localized power draw that had overridden the failing recycler. 10 minutes of viable air remaining. In the absolute darkness, guided only by the faint phosphorescence of the wires he had just connected, Dallin felt something new press against the exterior hull of Sector 4. It wasn't a thrumming or a vibration. It was a solid, immense weight moving slowly, scraping against the stressed metal skin of the platform. The sound was sickeningly organic, a wet, chitinous drag, like colossal claws testing the integrity of armor plating. The external observer was no longer content with observation or electronic interference. It was deploying physical assets. Dallin abandoned the junction box. The bypass was dead, the energy signature gone. The habitat spire was lost unless he could reach the external manual control overrides near the primary maneuvering thrusters, a near-impossible traverse across the fractured exterior hull. He unclipped the synth steel tether from the ceiling, knowing he needed the free-fall capability to cross the wider gaps. He initiated a slow, controlled push away from the ruined junction, drifting into the central void of the sector. As he cleared the last obstruction, the sound intensified. The scraping was replaced by a heavy, rhythmic thud directly above him, as if something massive was anchoring itself to the main dorsal spine of the Stygian dawn. Then, a piercing sound. Not energy, but physical stress, as a section of the outer hull 50 meters away buckled inward, not exploding outward into space, but collapsing inward, compressed like scrap metal under a hydraulic press. Through the absolute dark, just before his helmet lamp sputtered and died from the draining suit reserves, Dallin saw it. A sliver of light, impossibly bright and intensely alien, punched through the concave deformation in the hull. It wasn't a weapon beam. It was a focused cutting tool, operating with a deliberation that bespoke patience beyond human comprehension. The light fixed itself onto the structural supports leading directly to the habitat spire docking ring. The entity was not going to wait for Dagon's protocols to neutralize him. It was simply excising the final remaining piece of non-compliant biological presence. Dallin was pinned between a failing superstructure and an approaching, utterly systematic exterminator. The sound of the hull compressing was not an explosion, but a drawn-out, nauseating groan of stressed material finally yielding to pressure beyond calculation. It was the sound of a vast, unseen thing methodically dismantling a corpse. Dallin felt the platform shudder violently around him, the last vestige of rotational stability departing as the external anchors shifted their weight. The air in his suit, already thin and metallic, seemed to grow colder, the lingering heat of Sector 4 rapidly dissipating as the external environment imposed its own absolute thermal equilibrium. He kicked off the remnants of the ceiling structure with his good leg, launching himself across the wider gap toward the emergency access port leading to the outer hull maintenance tracks. Freefall was chaos in the zero-G rubble field of Sector 4, a disorienting tumble of floating equipment. He fought the spin, using the tension in his tether line for leverage, pulling himself along the remaining structural beams. His visor was now completely dark, the suit systems having shut down non-essential sensors to preserve the final reserves for comms and environmental integrity. He was navigating by feel and the distant grinding thud directly above him, the thing that had anchored itself to the Stygian dawn. He found the external port access, a narrow, manually sealed iris designed for EVA repairs. It was warped, the locking mechanism fused, but he remembered the emergency schematic from his exile posting. A secondary kinetic release solenoid housed externally, requiring a direct, powerful shock. He fumbled at his belt for the only remaining tool that might suffice, a geological survey charge designed for mapping deep core density, not breaching hulls. It was a low-yield kinetic pulse intended to ripple through rock, not steel. He slapped the charge onto the iris seam, keyed the timer for 3 seconds, barely enough time to shove himself clear, and threw himself backward into the relative shadow of a massive, inert coolant tank. The resulting shockwave was sharp, deafening, and thankfully localized. The iris exploded outward in a spray of superheated vapor and fractured metal shards. Dallin was thrown clear, tumbling out into the absolute vacuum of space, the platform already beginning to list dangerously beneath him. The tether, snapping taut, yanked him hard against his harness, a pain that threatened to black out his failing suit sensors completely. He activated the suit's emergency micro-thrusters, sputtering jets of nitrogen attempting to arrest his momentum away from the colossal bulk of the Stygian dawn. He was now free-floating, tethered only by a single thin line to the dying structure. He looked back. The alien presence was no longer a single point of light. Where the hull had been compressed, massive appendages, articulated with disturbing fluidity, were now actively pulling pieces of the platform apart. They were not weapons of energy, they were instruments of disassembly. And they were moving with unnatural speed toward the docking ring. Dallin focused his remaining strength on overriding the tether release. He needed separation, not a lifeline to a structure being actively scavenged. He found the emergency manual shear switch, a difficult lever requiring immense pressure. He ignored the fire in his arm and slammed his weight against it. The line snapped. Dallin accelerated away from the Stygian dawn and plunged into the cold, indifferent blackness surrounding Eclipse Haven. His helmet speakers suddenly cleared, the external interference vanishing as if a thick curtain had been yanked aside. The comms flooded with crisp, cold military chatter. Agent 2, confirmed separation. Target is clear of immediate structural collapse zone. Holding position outside exclusion perimeter. Rusick, report status. We are moving in for retrieval. Dallin managed a rasping reply, his voice choked with fatigue and the inadequate suit atmosphere. Agent 2, this is Rusick. Retrieval is premature. You cannot approach the structure. Negative, Rusick. Protocol mandates immediate exfiltration of all sentient personnel post-containment initiation. We have authorization from Sector Command to bypass Dagon's quarantine order due to confirmed hostile contact. It is not hostile contact in the way you understand it. Dallin forced the words out, tasting the bitterness of his last breaths. They are not attacking us. They are neutralizing a contaminant. The governor locked the platform to facilitate the cleanup. Dagon knew the nature of the energy signature. She engineered the failure of Ariza 6 and then used the isolation protocols here to bury the data permanently. There was a protracted silence on the GDA channel. The sound of Agent 2's breathing, a slow, controlled inhale and exhale, was suddenly amplified in the stillness of Dallin's suit speakers. Rusik, your telemetry indicates severe hypoxia and systemic stress. Your assertion regarding Governor Dagon's culpability requires verification. We are approaching the primary docking ring now to secure the Habitat Spire data cores. Stand by for medical transport. No, you don't understand the Thalnox. Dallin roared, the name erupting from the deepest recesses of his memory. A discarded footnote from his discredited thesis, a classification he had assigned to theoretical entities capable of systemic biological erasure through targeted informational density. They aren't interested in data cores. They are interested in the source of the disruption. If you approach the Habitat Spire, you are exposing your vessel to the full force of their containment measure. They won't destroy you with weapons. They will disassemble your informational matrix. The revelation struck Dallin like a physical blow, overriding the pain and the creeping numbness. The Thalnox didn't fight wars of territory or resources. They fought wars against biological deviation, against anything that exhibited uncontrolled informational complexity, which, in their cold calculus, included the volatile, self-propagating nature of human consciousness. Dagon hadn't feared the Thalnox. She had used them as a clean, undeniable excuse to eliminate political threats and scientific anomalies like him. Before Agent 2 could respond, the GDA tactical channel exploded into a cacophony of alarms. Vessel Vindicator reporting catastrophic systems failure, full diagnostic blackout. I repeat, full blackout on all primary and auxiliary systems. Bridge integrity compromised, pressure dropping rapidly in Habitation Deck 3. Not a breach, the bulkheads are fusing shut. The cold, systematic logic of the external entity had calculated the human response. The GDA would ignore the isolated engineer and move to secure the centralized population, the Habitat Spire. And the Thalnox reacted instantly to the massed informational signature. Dallin watched, paralyzed by the horror of his own accuracy, as the twin plumes of maneuvering thruster fire from the approaching GDA cruiser, the Vindicator, winked out of existence. The cruiser didn't explode or shatter, it simply ceased to function, instantly transformed from a vessel of war into an inert chunk of metal tumbling silently through the void, already succumbing to the encroaching silent cold. His final desperate act of warning had confirmed the worst. The GDA, acting on established protocols, had delivered the population center directly into the entity's quarantine zone. Dallin was alive, a loose end, but the inhabitants of the Spire, perhaps 5,000 souls, were now facing the same systemic informational purge he had narrowly avoided. The Thalnox had finished its external assessment of the Stygian dawn. Now it was moving on to the primary biological cluster. Dallin looked toward the distant weak glow of the Habitat Spire, a fragile bubble against the crushing dark. He had failed to save the platform, failed to alert the military in time, and in doing so had handed the entity the largest viable target. Survival for him meant accepting the failure and drifting into the protective darkness of the outer asteroid field. Salvation, a concept he barely believed in anymore, meant one last, suicidal maneuver. He activated the last emergency reserve in his maneuvering unit, a single, desperate burst of thrust, directed not away from the disaster, but directly toward the dead hulk of the Vindicator, which was already beginning to drift toward the catastrophic influence radiating from the Stygian dawn. He had to reach that wreckage, not for escape, but to transmit a single, massive burst of raw, unmodulated data, a chaotic scream of informational noise designed to overload whatever delicate analytical filtering the Thalnox was employing. It would be a signal of pure, unfiltered human defiance, a final desperate attempt to make himself a contaminant too complex, too volatile, to be cleanly erased. The odds of survival registered 0.000. Dallin pushed the thruster trigger down, committing himself to a collision course with the wreckage of the ship he had tried to save. The nitrogen jets sputtered their pathetic final bursts, throwing Dallin Russick agonizingly slow toward the corpse of the Vindicator. He was propelled by a singular, desperate intention, an act of sabotage so fundamentally pointless it bordered on suicidal mania. Survival, the ingrained imperative of the organism, screamed at him to use the remaining thrust vector to vector away from the epicenter of the Thalnox field, to retreat into the cold, anonymous dust clouds of Eclipse Haven. But the memory of 5,000 souls, sealed into the habitat spire by administrative decree and now being computationally erased, tasted like ash in his throat. He drifted past the failing tether that had connected him to the Stygian dawn. The mining platform was no longer recognizably artificial. It was a broken spider, its limbs rent by unseen forces, its core structure being slowly folded inward by the colossal, scraping presence. The Thalnox had not needed to fire a weapon. It had simply applied the correct force vector to the stressed components, demonstrating that violence, as humans understood it, was inefficient. Dallin realized the agonizing truth. He had survived only because he was an anomaly, an insignificant footnote outside the primary target zone, the quarantined industrial asset, and now, the centralized population center. He was too small to warrant immediate computational processing. A loose thread, not yet knotted into the tapestry of failure. The cold was absolute now, penetrating the failing insulation of his suit, settling deep into the marrow of his bones. He felt the crushing weight of his own inadequacy. All his analysis, his warnings, the disgrace he had carried since Ars the Say had been correct, yet utterly useless. He had known the truth, possessed the map of the danger, and still his species, driven by ingrained arrogance and petty bureaucratic control, exercised by figures like Brina Dagan, had marched directly into the digital maw. His good hand, cramping violently, fought to manipulate the external diagnostic panel on his wrist, the one component still receiving residual power from the suit's auxiliary cell. He needed to modulate the final charge, the geological pulse, not as a tool for breaching, but as a directional data dump, a message written in pure, unreadable chaos. He bypassed the final safety lock. The internal display flickered, showing the charge level at an alarming 3% capacity. If he fired it here, at this distance, the dispersion pattern would be too wide, the signal too diluted to register as anything more than random static against the immense processing power of the Thalnox field engulfing the spire. He needed to be closer, much closer. He needed to feel the informational drag directly. He oriented himself toward the drifting ruin of the Vindicator. It spun lazily, the result of its internal systems being instantaneously dissolved. He could see no external hull damage. The destruction was total, complete, internal. The ghost of Agent 2 was somewhere in that frozen metal tomb. Dallin burned the last trickle of his emergency nitrogen, throwing himself toward the cruiser's forward sensor array, the point of maximum external receptivity. He collided with the silent hull, the impact jarring his entire frame, sending a fresh wave of nausea through his helmet. He grabbed hold of a protruding antenna housing, his gloves scraping uselessly against the smooth inert plating. He was close enough. He ripped the survey charge from his belt, the adhesive patch sticking instantly to the hull of the Vindicator. He primed the timer, setting it for the shortest possible duration, 0.5 seconds. It would be a spike, not a sustained transmission, designed to overload the immediate sensory input fields of the Thalnox monitoring the spire. He was banking everything on the entity, prioritizing the efficient erasure of the 5,000 over the chaotic distraction of one dying engineer. He hammered the activation stud with his thumb. The small device glowed a faint, warning crimson. 2 seconds remaining. Dallin closed his eyes, not in preparation for death, but in an attempt to shut out the visual horror of the distant spire, to focus entirely on the internal, auditory feedback of the charge counting down. He felt the familiar, unsettling pressure return, not the grinding thrum of the earlier scan, but a subtle, high-frequency hum directly interfacing with his suit's failing power core. It felt it. The spike in informational chaos from the geological charge had been instantly detected. The Thalnox had pivoted its processing resources. The countdown stopped. The crimson light extinguished. The charge was inert, disabled before detonation. A wave of profound, suffocating defeat washed over Dallin. The enemy was not merely faster, it was omniscient in its domain. It had analyzed his intent, predicted the timing, and neutralized the weapon without diverting significant resources from the erasure of the habitat spire. Dallin had achieved absolute zero utility. He was simply irrelevant noise, silenced before it could even be broadcast. He slumped against the dead hull of the Vindicator, the cold leaching the last warmth from his body. He should have fled. He should have conserved the final breath of air for himself, drifted into the shadow of an outer moon, and let Dagon's bureaucracy erase the truth along with the spire. He had chosen the path of futile sacrifice, a choice that served no tactical purpose, offered no tactical advantage, and changed nothing in the grand, indifferent sweep of galactic war. The weight of that decision, not the weight of the suit, but the weight of wasted intent, was immense. He thought with a chilling clarity of the philosophers whose works he had studied in exile, those who argued that true heroism was not facing death bravely, but accepting the logical necessity of retreat for future action. He had failed the logic test. He had succumbed to the most base human impulse, the desire to say something before the dark. The suit's environmental system gave a final, pathetic sigh. The internal pressure readout vanished, replaced by a single flashing icon. Atmospheric failure imminent. He had perhaps 60 seconds of residual oxygen remaining, enough time for the last vestiges of carbon dioxide to flood his system and bring about a slow, painless fade into blackness. He opened his eyes. The Thalnox field was still focused on the spire, its systematic dismantling continuing. But something new was happening on the derelict Stygian dawn. The massive claw-like appendages had retracted slightly. The immense pressure anchoring the entity was easing. Dallin realized the Thalnox was preparing to leave. Its mandate was containment, erasure of the anomaly. The spire was being cleansed, and the immediate threat from the dawn, the source of the initial informational spike, had been physically neutralized. The objective was achieved. The zone would soon be sterilized, and the local galactic powers would move in, finding only inert debris and confirming Governor Dagon's initial convenient narrative of industrial accident. The Thalnox was retreating, leaving behind a graveyard of technology and lives, satisfied with the efficiency of its computation. Then Dallin saw it. Not a flash of light, not a structural shift, but a subtle, almost imperceptible distortion of space-time near the Vindicator's primary warp drive housing. It was the same effect he had registered from the dawn, the localized erasure of background radiation noise, but this time it was small, ephemeral, and rapidly receding. The Thalnox wasn't just leaving, it was actively erasing its own footprint from the immediate vicinity of the cruiser. And in that exact spot, where the distortion had been most intense, a single minute object detached itself from the dead metal of the Vindicator. It was small, no larger than Dallen's thumb, and it drifted slowly, silently, toward him. It was the only piece of matter that had been in direct, intense contact with the retreating entity. He used the final micro-thruster charge, a fraction of a second of directed thrust, not to flee, but to intercept the drifting object. His gloved fingers closed around it, just as his suit alarms began to scream a final warning, a high-pitched tone that dissolved into the ragged sound of his own desperate gasp. The object was warm, impossibly smooth, and vibrated with a barely perceptible energy. It was not Veskar technology, nor human. It was a sliver of the Thalnox itself, shed in its hasty withdrawal. A piece of the contaminant it was attempting to eliminate. Dallen held the fragment tight against his chest plate, feeling the agonizing pressure of his lungs collapsing without fresh air. He had nothing left. No life support, no allies, no hope of rescue before the Thalnox completed its sterilization sweep. But he held the only physical piece of evidence in the entire sector, a relic from the apex predator. He angled his body, using the momentum from the intercept, and forced himself to look past the dead Vindicator toward the silent, cold expanse of the outer asteroid belt, the only place the GDA search teams would never risk entering. He had failed to save his people, failed to stop the cover-up, but perhaps, just perhaps, he held the key to proving the truth of what had transpired here, even if he died proving it. He began the slow, deliberate, airless drift away from the scene of the execution, kicking off gently from the Vindicator's hull, the pain receding as the oxygen starved his brain. He was now adrift, a final dying piece of debris in the vast, silent graveyard of Eclipse Haven, clutching the impossible proof of humanity's encounter with its silent, computational executioner. The cold began to sharpen, promising an end that was at least free of bureaucratic oversight. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The fragment, still radiating that low alien warmth against the plastron of his suit, was the only thing anchoring Dallen to consciousness. 60 seconds had evaporated into the void, replaced by the thick, burning sensation of atmospheric decay. He was adrift, tumbling slowly, the massive, silent skeleton of the Vindicator receding with agonizing slowness. The Thalnox entity had already pulled its processing focus entirely away from him, satisfied that the loose thread was now inert and drifting toward the dark. The energy field that had held the 5,000 in digital purgatory was collapsing, not with an explosion, but with a gentle systemic simplification, the universe returning to its expected noise floor. Dallen ignored the screaming red warnings flashing across his visor overlay. His focus was entirely on the geometry of the fragment in his grip. It was not data storage. It was physically part of the entity. He recalled the archaic, forbidden texts he had studied in isolation, texts concerning first contact protocols that assumed an opponent incapable of conceptualizing abstraction. The Thalnox operated on pure, ruthless efficiency. It eliminated threats based on the calculus of resource expenditure versus threat neutralization. Dallen, by failing to detonate the charge and instead becoming inert debris, had shifted his threat quotient to near zero, allowing the system to allocate processing power back to the primary target, the Spire. His mind, sharpened by the hypoxia, latched onto a desperate, almost insane corollary. If the Thalnox was purely efficient, it must logically eliminate all traceable remnants of its presence, or at least the most complex remnants. The Vindicator, having been breached by his proximity, represented a significant informational contamination point. The subtle distortion he had witnessed was not merely a retreat. It was a localized cleanup operation, He fought the urge to gasp, a reflexive action that would only hasten the end. He forced his eyes to focus on the structural integrity readouts of his own suit. The main pressure integrity was gone, but the internal atmospheric scrubber, running on its independent low-voltage battery, was still fighting a losing battle against the vacuum. It was injecting the last meager reserves of reclaimed oxygen, filtering the increasing tide of carbon dioxide. It was buying him seconds, perhaps minutes, of controlled suffocation rather than instant decompression. This margin, this pathetic allowance for dying slowly, was his only tactical advantage. Dallin engaged the suit's manual maintenance override, a system designed for deep-core repairs on the Stygian dawn, a system Governor Deegan had neglected to fully deactivate. He rerouted the scrubber's residual power, cannibalizing the cooling systems, the failing inertial dampeners, anything that drew even a minuscule current. He directed every erg of remaining energy into the magnetic clamps in his gloves, strengthening the bond with the alien sliver. The purpose was not communication, but preservation. If he could not survive to deliver the evidence must survive his proximity to the immediate contamination zone. He needed to get further from the primary kill zone, further from the area the Thalnox was actively sweeping clean. He angled his body, his movements slow, deliberate, like a creature adjusting to profound atmospheric pressure change. He utilized the slight residual rotational momentum from the Vindicator's death spin, converting it into a long, shallow arc aimed toward the deepest shadow between two large, inert silicate masses in the Eclipse Haven field. The suit's internal light began to strobe erratically, the power draw for the enhanced magnetic grip proving too much for the crippled auxiliary cell. He was now navigating by the distant cold light of the twin suns, the silhouette of the massive, dead cruiser a monument to catastrophic systemic failure behind him. Then, the computational silence broke. It was not the ordered, pulsing hum of the Thalnox, but a sharp, metallic shriek of localized proximity alarms echoing through the dead comms channels of the Vindicator. Dallin froze his rotation, his heart, or what felt like his heart, seizing in his chest. The Thalnox had not left entirely. It had deployed secondary assets, a cluster of 3 drone interceptors detached from the Vindicator's wreckage. They were compact, angular shapes, clearly designed for localized recovery and sterilization, utilizing focused energy beams rather than wide-spectrum field manipulation. They were the cleanup crew, the logical next step after the primary intelligence had confirmed the threat had been negated. They were coming for the small, anomalous heat signature, the alien fragment he held. Dallin felt a surge of adrenaline, the last chemical defense his dying body could muster. He had traded the Spire's 5,000 lives for the chance to expose the truth, and now the truth was being actively hunted by the bureaucratic cleanup squad. He looked down at the fragment. It was too small to be a weapon, too inert to be a beacon. It was data, embedded in physical space. He had to break the connection, sever the traceable signature that was leading the drones directly to him. With a final, agonizing exertion of his already failing grip strength, Dallin forced his hand open. The alien sliver, protected momentarily by the magnetic pulse, tumbled free. He did not watch where it fell. That was irrelevant. He watched the drones. They were programmed to recover and analyze contamination. As the first drone closed the gap, its maneuvering thrusters spitting controlled bursts of plasma, Dallin did the only thing left to do. He turned his dying suit into a target. He manually diverted the last functioning cell's energy, the one powering the scrubber, directly into the exterior heating coils of his right leg assembly. The metal plating around his thigh instantly superheated. Not enough to breach the hull, but enough to radiate a sudden localized burst of infrared energy, a signature that perfectly mimicked a critical, localized systems failure on a dying human-piloted vessel. The lead drone aborted its approach vector toward the drifting fragment. Its internal logic, trained on predictable human equipment failure, prioritized the immediate threat signature emitting from the closest source of uncontrolled heat discharge, Dallin Rusick. The drone locked onto him, its targeting array focusing a beam of intense, tightly controlled kinetic energy, not a blast, but a piercing spike designed to penetrate the hull and disable the heat source instantly. Dallin braced himself, the movement costing him precious seconds of oxygen. He saw the beam form, a thin blue-white needle aimed precisely at his center mass. This was not the elegant dissolution of the Thalnox. This was crude, blunt force enforcement of protocol. The kinetic spike struck. It did not penetrate the primary armor layer. Instead, the energy focused on the weakened, compromised joint where the suit's life support umbilical was fused to the chest plate. The connection, already strained by the earlier impacts, vaporized in a shower of incandescent sparks. The catastrophic failure was total and immediate. The air rushed out of Dallin's suit in a silent, violent explosion. The pressure dropped to zero in less than half a second. The pain of decompression was momentary, instantly superseded by the absolute shocking cessation of physical sensation. The world went silent, the internal alarms dying in a final sputtering whine. He floated, weightless, not suffocating, but simply absent of atmosphere, a frozen statue drifting toward the shadow. The drones, their primary heat signature target neutralized, paused. The heat source was gone. Their programming dictated a final sweep for residual contamination, the location where the fragment had fallen. As Dallin drifted past the point of no return, his vision beginning to tunnel into an opaque blackness, he saw the 3 drones converge on the area where the alien sliver had landed. They were retrieving it. The physical evidence was secured by the enemy's retrieval unit. But Dallin had achieved his chaotic disruption. The drones, now occupied with securing the contaminant, were no longer actively sweeping the spire zone for residual energy signatures. In that micro-window of confusion, caused by the sudden, violent self-destruction of the engineer, the Thalnox processing field, the field holding the 5000 in informational stasis, had been momentarily allowed to collapse entirely, unbound by the retrieval logic. The digital erasure had failed. He did not know if they were free or if they had been violently expelled into a different form of containment. He only knew that the focused computational erasure had stopped. Dallin's last coherent thought, before the freezing darkness claimed his cortex entirely, was not of triumph, but of cost. He had traded his verifiable proof, the physical shard, for a single moment of informational chaos that might have saved 5,000 people he had never met. People who would never know the name of the mechanic who died freezing in the dark to overload a glorified data filter. He was not a hero. He was a spent component, a necessary sacrifice whose existence would be scrubbed by the bureaucracy of Governor Dagan, just as surely as the Thalnox had tried to scrub the galaxy clean. He was the final, ignored anomaly, fading into the galactic archive of forgotten failures. The inertial dampeners in the rescue transport were inadequate, unable to smooth out the constant grinding tremor of the hull. It was the sound of 1,000 slow-motion impacts, the residual stress of having survived the localized collapse of a reality field. Dallin Rusick did not look at the transport's internal diagnostics. He did not need the readouts to confirm the state of his own body. The suit, miraculously pressurized by emergency patches near the core access points, was keeping the vacuum out, but it could not contain the internal damage. His right leg was fused to the deck plating by residual magnetic flux and scar tissue. His ribs felt like shattered silicate dust beneath the plastron. Survival was not a victory. It was an administrative delay. He watched the debris field from the primary observation slit. Eclipse Haven was quiet again, the silence heavier than before the attack. The Thalnox had retreated, Not because it was defeated, but because the cost-benefit ratio of continuing the localized containment had spiked too high after the Spire's accidental release. The Citadel fleet would arrive in 3 standard cycles, their purpose unclear: to secure the wreckage for proprietary analysis, or to execute the required planetary quarantine protocols against the sector, eliminating all potential sources of contamination, the living included. Brina Dagan was alive. The official, heavily redacted transmission stated that the command spire had experienced a major systems failure during the anomalous energy surge, but had maintained structural integrity sufficient for emergency staging. Dallin knew the truth. The spire survived because the Thalnox, in its ruthless efficiency, chose to neutralize the active, traceable threat, the Vindicator and the orbital defenses, before dealing with the passive threat of 5,000 trapped individuals. Dallin's self-immolation had bought them the time needed for the Citadel to register the event. A flawed, messy salvation built upon an engineer's calculated suicide. The transport shifted, the movement sickeningly slow, pulling them away from the grave of the Stygian dawn. Dallin reached up, his gloved fingers finding the manual release for the helmet seal. Protocol dictated the helmet remain sealed until atmosphere checks confirmed environmental stability on the receiving vessel, but Dallin had no intention of entering a stable environment. He needed to feel the air, whatever it was, on his skin one last time without filtration, without the comforting barrier of technology that had both saved and failed him. The seal hissed, a sound of defeat, and the stale, conditioned air of the rescue craft met the chilled, recycled air trapped inside his helmet. It tasted flat, metallic, and utterly ordinary. The smell of ozone was gone, replaced by the sterile neutrality of official recovery efforts. He looked down at his hand, the one that had gripped the alien fragment until the last possible second. There was nothing there now. The drones had secured the evidence of first contact, classifying the residue as Thalnox contamination, not proof of a third party or a third method of warfare. The official record would read, localized energy spike caused by gravitational shear stress. System defense protocols enacted successfully. Minor civilian losses due to structural failure. His existence would be carefully scrubbed from the operational logs, marked down as presumed lost in action during initial defense against stellar phenomena. He thought back to the observation slit on the dawn, the moment the fractal pattern blossomed against the blackness. He remembered the feeling of being seen, not as a warrior, not as a technician, but as an equation being balanced by a superior intelligence. That level of scrutiny did not vanish with a shift in processing focus. It simply moved on to the next item on the priority list. Humanity, having scraped past annihilation by sheer, clumsy happenstance, was already returning to its ingrained habits. Obfuscation, minimizing liability, and preparing for the next, inevitable systemic breach. Dallin finally managed to dislodge the main lock on the helmet and pulled the visor up, letting the cool, recycled air wash over his face. His eyes, accustomed to the sharp edges of emergency lighting and tactical displays, found the interior of the transport offensively dull. He saw his own reflection in the plexiglass viewport. A man aged decades in a single rotation, skin grayed by vacuum exposure and stress. The lines around his mouth etched deep by decisions he couldn't afford to second-guess. There would be no debriefing. Governor Dagan would ensure his file was permanently sealed. He was a witness to an event that could not be admitted into the political calculus of the Citadel. If he spoke, he would be silenced not by alien fire, but by bureaucratic containment, the same system he had tried to outmaneuver to save the Spire. To live openly was to admit the extent of the cover-up, and the Citadel valued stability above existential truth. He eased himself further into the seat, ignoring the excruciating protest of his right leg. He was intact enough to be useful, but compromised enough to be disposable. a perfect candidate for quiet reassignment to a deep-core refinery, far from any sensor capable of detecting the specific resonance of alien technology. He would spend the remainder of his operational lifespan supervising pressure valves on systems that were already failing, maintaining the illusion of order. He closed his eyes, letting the engine's steady, irritating thrum fill the void left by the high-pitched whine of the Thalnox. The journey back to Centauri Prime would be long, a passage through familiar, controlled space. He was returning to the predictable grind he had once tried to escape, a prison built not of bulkheads, but of necessary lies. He opened his eyes again, staring not at the transport's interior, but through the viewport toward the infinite, cold expanse they were traversing. He focused on the way the light from distant, uncaring stars fractured across the warped composite plating of the transport hull, the same way the light had always fractured across the worn alloy of the pressure valve on the Stygian dawn before the silence came. He was back where he started, observing decay, knowing the hidden threat remained catalogued, waiting for the next predictable failure to present itself. The pressure hull groaned, a familiar, deeply resonant sound deep in his chest, a constant reminder that all structure is temporary. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an. Abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.